and I had never heard this term before. But anti-miscegenation laws, or miscegenation laws are laws that enforce racial segregation at the level of marriage and intimate relationships by criminalizing interracial marriage, and sometimes also sex between members of different
And I
races.
actually looked up the word minority, and the dictionary was written back in the 50s and 40s. So there was the terminology that was written in there. Now they done changed the terminology now, updated it. But the terminology for minority said, and I remember I showed it to my wife. It said a group or demographics of people too small to have control. Okay, so literally written by the dominant European culture, they specifically the terminology that we keep saying to ourselves, okay, that we are too small and not able to have control. And I reject that word. And I remember Andy and we talked about that. I have to reject that word because you only a minority in your head, okay, and you can't have control. But when you have when you have an institution, the dominant European culture constantly telling you you too small, you too inferior, you're not capable to have control. We keep perpetuating that, and I just reject that word moving.
We were looking at the building of a colony at that time. America was a British colony. You had some parts of America that was Spanish, some parts of America, the North American continent definitely that was French as well. So what you had was a race to build a nation, all right, and to build a nation to produce wealth, to produce resources, all right, to produce more, like I said, more wealth and riches. So when we talk about slavery, okay, and we have to be fair about it, is you had British slaves were the first slaves, okay, in America. All right, British men slaves were the first ones.
Mhm.
And when we talk about 1619, what was the difference between the British slave, all right, and the African slave? As a British slave had a chance to be an indentured servant. Um, their conditions of slavery were through transportation. They may have committed a crime. They may have had to pay some sort of a debt, all right, back to be able to get to America, some sort of way. Whereas the African slave was the Latin term is called durante vita, durante vita, all right, meaning that you will be a slave for your entire life, all right. Durante means duration, vita means life, duration of life. So there was no, initially there was no, for an African slave, there was no reprieve. Only reprieve from slavery was death. So this is what you see in the early beginning stages. Now you also had, Bacon's Rebellion during that time because you had British men and African men said, hey, the conditions of slavery, even though the African man was a slave for life, the British man still they would do things, even though if you had a 7 year or 9 year or whatever your term was, if you missed a quota, if you did, you'd get
Yeah.
penalties to get, now all of a sudden, instead of the 7 years, now we're looking at 15 years, 25 years. So this is what Nathaniel Bacon, right? You had a lot of British men say, wait a minute, this was not the deal. So, are you making it almost impossible, right? So, the slave owners realized the value of this free, cheap
They had a
labor.
common understanding, did it? Yeah, they had a
Right,
common
right.
agreement.
So,
Yeah,
so they
yeah.
said, we can't just let this go like this. We want to try to make sure that all of these people who are enslaved will stay enslaved for as long as we possibly can have them because we were making all types of money off of that. So that's what led to the rebellion.
Right.
Is the unfair, and what you had is a coalition of African men, right, and of British men, okay, fighting. And initially,
Indentured. Yeah, indentured.
yeah,
Yeah, right.
and
Exactly.
initially the slave masters of Virginia, or the slave class of Virginia, hired the Native Americans to first fight against the slave class, right? So after
Now,
that,
now,
after that, after that, didn't I mean they took like the war was not over, but no one won, no one lost. Then after that, the Native Americans actually joined along with the
Right.
joined along with the British and the African slaves to fight. So by then, the Virginia was able to get British troops to come in. All right, the British
And
sailors and
slaughtered them.
boats,
Yeah.
yeah, and they squashed the rebellion. But here's what they learned from that. They learned that the labor class will always seek freedom and will always seek justice for themselves. And they will always outnumber the elite. They will always outnumber an army, any type of paramilitary police force, anything. So what they did in 1681 was they revised the miscegenation law, right? And within that law, they created the term white. Okay, if you were a free white man, okay, you had certain privileges, and this was the creation of white privilege at that time, because before then there was no such thing as white, a white person. What is that? I'm British, I'm Irish, I'm this, I'm that. You identified by your nationality.
Yep.
So by doing that, what did they do? They divided the labor class. So it's immediately as they did that, they started to create laws to actually hurt and damage Native Americans and enslaved Africans at the time. So
And their offspring.
yeah, they really put the hammer down, right?
so read. I wanted to define this, Leonard,
Yep,
because you
on
used this
miscegenation. Yeah,
term,
yep.
and I had never heard this term before. But anti-miscegenation laws, or miscegenation laws are laws that enforce racial segregation at the level of marriage and intimate relationships by criminalizing interracial marriage, and sometimes also sex between members of different races. I'll be honest. When I
Amen.
was when I was stuck in a color construct, um, you know, I thought I honestly believe that white people should have sex with white people and black people should have sex with black people. There should be no spawn coming from their intermingling in any way. I've since grown from that thought process and say, hey, do as you please. But nonetheless, in an idea to keep the races pure and things of that nature, that was my thought process.
Yeah.
So it seems that thought process was shared among the elite at the time.
Right, right. It was not
And
just
and
shared; it was enforced. Well, the reason why they did that is because what was happening is, like I said, you had all of the. Typically, you had men as slaves. Well, as a man, you want a woman, right? And what was happening is African men. What they did was they said, okay, if any British woman, right, were to marry an African man, these are the laws of husbandry. Now you take on his role. Okay, so you would become a slave for life, right? So they really so and this was not just to just, but what the intent was is, okay, so if you become a slave for life, then that means your children are slaves for life, and we can have a perpetuation of slavery without having to send ships and go and trade slaves in Africa and bring slaves back. We can have some homegrown slaves right here in America and just keep this thing going for as long as we wanted to. So that was,
And
that was the
there
business side of doing that.
and there began a new demographics of humanity born on American soil. And that's where I was telling people that I don't tell me about what took place in Africa, about slavery and all that. Let's talk about the force and bred and created new humanity through like Noah Schultz said, we were bred. Our demographics of people based on the color of our skin, we were bred to be inferior, unintelligent, and servient to the dominant European culture. And that makes us a whole new breed of people born right here on American soil. That's very important as people be listening to this, that we have an inheritance that the dominant European culture, kind of in the same way of Jacob in Esau, we have an inheritance that was stolen from us, okay? That because our humanity was not allowed to exist in the natural, normal form. So when you think about that, that's why we have an inheritance and a birthrights in this country. I'm just trying to tie all that in, Leonard, while you are going through this.
And Leonard touched on it. My people, the Irish, were the first indentured servants of the British. When you look at it, the word heathen, which the Africans were considered heathens and the Native Americans non-Christian, that was accused of the Irish people. The first people that the British labels as heathens were the Irish people. And then that's the idea of when white supremacy ideology in the 1400s, 1500s, even before the slaves came to America, that germinated that anyone who was not of, the European and really mostly British background were heathens, and they were less than the, so-called the white race. And as we talked before, what for many, the idea that there's five separate races, that's really the core teaching of white supremacy, that there's five different species of human beings. And so we hear why they shouldn't intermarry, because one species should not intermarry with another species. Well, that's something we still need to repudiate, because we're using the same terminology of white, black, red, yellow, and brown
Exactly.
that came out about in the 1400s and the 1500s. And until we solve that problem, we're not going to have much. We're just going to have conflict, because when you separate, we're either one human race or we're different species. And Darwin taught the survival of the fittest. If we're five species, we should be fighting and killing each other because we're dominance. And if we're one human family, then we should learn to get along and support each other. So we either going to decide we're going to continue down this crazy doctrine and ideology that there's five races and they're based on skin color, or we're one human family.
And Peter, just
Hey,
to, Peter,
Joe.
just to interject right quick, that concept came from a guy named Carl Linnaeus. I think he was either Dutch or Swedish, and he came up. He wrote a book called Systema Natura, I believe that's what it was called, and he broke down the characteristics of race of different people based upon absolutely no scientific knowledge
Exactly.
whatsoever.
Yeah.
So they using that as a template is how we get to where we are today with these divisions among the labor classes. So
Yep.
Yeah. So
Hey, so
movements that went on in the UK in Britain that caused you did have actually some people that were abolitionists, all right, and were against slavery in Britain. And you had those people, and then you had those business people that actually saw how slavery had started to become unsustainable. What they don't tell you in history is all of the revolts and rebellions and different things that were happening that slaves were doing. From the Maroons in Jamaica to the California people in the island of Isla Ruatan that fought back against their oppressors. It had started to become, especially if you were a colonizer like the UK, where you were so far away from your colonies and so small and had very limited resources, okay, it was starting to become very unsustainable. So I believe around 1846, 1847 is when slavery, when the British outlawed slavery. So you still had the Americas and the Spaniards and the Portuguese and some of the French still practicing and still doing slavery. This is where piracy came from. But like I said, is so it started to become unsustainable. and we started to move into an industrialized economy, went from agrarian to industrialized. So that helped push along the end of human slavery, but still, you still needed cheap labor. But the labor of a machine could always outdo the labor of people, and it was easier to deal with. So that's kind of where you started to get this movement, plus the moral aspects of it. I think the song "Amazing Grace," the person who wrote the song actually lost his voice um, because he went on a silent strike until slavery had ended.
With what we stated earlier, the Africans were not allowed to be, they didn't have a 7 year, they were lifetime property, which is definitely
Mm-hmm.
different.
And
And not
and
only
and
you, but your descendants, if someone was in
right
indentured servitude, doesn't mean that their family would be an indentured servant.
here, as my father was talking about, they force our demographics of people to live double-mindedly. Okay, where we feared the white man and we loved the Lord. We loved the Lord and we feared the white man. And at sometimes made the white man even greater than the Lord because we feared the Lord. We feared the white man more than we feared God. And so that's
Well,
where,
to go along with that, Uncle Mishon, it was taught that God was white. So you
yeah,
know,
it to
pictures and everything that were painted and everything was taught that God
It's
was white.
called
So
propaganda in
God
the military.
and the white man were almost synonymous
Well,
back
it,
then.
it's and the reason why I want to bring this up because culturally, we never talk about the propaganda that America, the dominant European culture, actually did to our demographic and just messed our heads up. I mean, did you see the pictures? I got pictures here, and I got my wife and I. We say, they made our men look like monsters, creatures, ugly, crazy. I mean, the same propaganda that the
Mm-hmm.
military uses overseas to raise fear in people and everything. Our own government and our own dominant European culture use Christianity to, that's what the Nathan Turner was all about. Nathan Turner was a good slave. He was a good boy.
Nat
Man,
Turner.
he was trying to serve his master to the full extent, okay, to what being a good Negro, good slave, until they messed with his wife, until he started learning the
Mm-hmm.
Bible and he started realizing that the Bible had been used against them to keep them docile. And so the history that we were taught about Nat Turner is that he was a monstrous man that went around killing
Mm-hmm.
good white people, okay, for no
Mm-hmm.
reason. He had no reason to kill white people.
But
Okay?
And if you're an oppressor, you want your oppressed to not fight back, right? Just like those 100 slaves, they decided to fight back and freedom, where the other later on they couldn't do that. Well, just think about it. If you want oppressed people not to fight back, you should teach them that it's against the will of God to fight authority, and authority is there, and you hear that a lot. So I think that was used in general, just be a good slave, and and the thought that you're going to be rewarded in the afterlife. So yeah, you're being screwed over here on earth, but guess what? You're going to magically have a mansion made of gold,
yep.
in the spirit world. I mean, that's very, and even to this day, that's very compelling for people. Well, I'm going to be in a better place. Oh yeah, maybe not. I don't know. It was a big business. Cotton was king. Cotton was the number one commodity in the world at that time. So, you know, it was a huge business. It was almost like, say, okay, here's the internet business of today. It was the internet, of back then. Cotton, I think 80% of all the world's cotton was raised in Southern America through the slaves, and you know, it was sold, and a lot of people in New York and up north made money because they had the shipping. They would carry the cotton up and they would ship it overseas. So cotton was king. That was a famous saying. So it was a major industry, and billions and trillions of dollars worth of industry. And as Leonard mentioned earlier, once the Industrial Revolution came, where manufacturing, the South and the way they were doing things lost its economic base, and that's one reason why slavery was dissolved. But at that time, for that 150 years, cotton was king.
Where a lot of that jealousy came from. You had men that were gone to war, and when they came back, they're looking and they're like, oh, while we've been gone, these Negroes.
Look at these Negroes. Look what they've been doing.
They were
mad.
Up.
Yeah. Oh man.
Up.
They came back. That's why they bombed. Think about who bombed. Think about who bombed Black Wall Street. Just keep it 100. It was ex-military people who came back and seen that the descendants of American slaves, they were living large. Shit, what the hell? They were.